They gave everything to reach space. And space never called their names. Not because they failed, not because they washed out, but because the programs they trained for were erased, canceled, defunded, shut down, with them still standing on the ground, flight-ready, waiting for a launch that would never come. There were two groups of these men. One trained for a machine that never carried a single human being into orbit. The other was welcomed to NASA by a man who told them, in effect, that nobody needed them. And here is the part that should stop you cold. The survivors of both groups waited between 12 and 16 years, over a decade of their lives, before any of them ever reached space. Some never did at all. Let's start with the machine that never flew. In the mid-1960s, the United States Air Force had its own plan to put men in orbit. Not NASA, the Air Force. It was called the Manned Orbiting Laboratory, the MOL. The idea was a small crewed space station, a reconnaissance platform where military pilots would live and work in orbit. To fly it, the Air Force needed a new kind of astronaut, and it began selecting them. The first group was announced on November 12, 1965. 8 pilots: Michael J. Adams, Albert H. Cruz Jr., John L. Finley, Richard E. Lawyer, Lachlan McLeay, Francis G. Neubeck, James M. Taylor, and a young naval aviator named Richard H. Truly. Remember that name. A second group followed on June 17, 1966. 5 more: Carol J. Bobko, Robert L. Crippen, C. Gordon Fullerton, Henry W. Hartsfield Jr., Robert F. Overmyer, and a third group on June 30, 1967. 4 men: James A. Abrahamson, Robert T. Harris, Donald H. Peterson, and Robert H. Lawrence Jr. Hold on that last name too. We'll come back to him because his story is one of the most important and most heartbreaking in the entire program. 17 pilots in all, 17 men selected, trained, and told they were going to orbit the Earth aboard a laboratory in the sky. They studied, they prepared, they waited. But the years were working against them. The Vietnam War was draining budgets. Reconnaissance satellites, the uncrewed kind, were getting better and cheaper, and they didn't need a human being risking his life to operate them. The question hanging over the whole program grew louder. Why send men when a machine could do the same job for less? The answer came on June 10, 1969. The Nixon administration canceled the Manned Orbiting Laboratory. Think about what that meant. In the entire history of the MOL program, there was exactly one test flight, an uncrewed one, back in 1966. Not a single human being ever flew the machine these 17 men had given years of their lives to. The laboratory in the sky was canceled before it ever carried a soul. So what happens to 17 fully trained astronauts when their program simply vanishes? For most of them, nothing. The door to space closed. NASA agreed to take some of them, but with one hard, unsentimental condition: only pilots under the age of 35. Age. That was the line. Cross it, and no matter how skilled you were left behind. 7 men made the cut. On August 14, 1969, they were announced as NASA's Astronaut Group 7: Bobko, Crippen, Fullerton, Hartsfield, Overmyer, Peterson, and Truly. And here the story finally turns upward, because every single one of those 7 eventually flew. Not soon, not for years. But in the 1980s, they all reached orbit aboard the space shuttle. Robert Crippen went first on STS-1, the very first flight of the space shuttle in April 1981. The man whose Air Force program had been canceled without a single crewed launch became the pilot of the most ambitious spacecraft America had ever built. But keep your eye on the arithmetic. Crippen was selected in 1966. He flew in 1981. 15 years. 15 years of waiting for the door to open again. Now, the ones who didn't make the cut. Because for every man who transferred to NASA, there was another left standing outside. There was an 8th MOL pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Albert H. Cruz. He did join NASA, not as an astronaut, but in the Flight Crew Operations Directorate. He worked for the space program. He was there, inside the building, close enough to touch it. And he never flew in space, not once. And then there is Robert H. Lawrence, Jr. When Lawrence was selected on June 30th, 1967, he became the first African American ever chosen as an astronaut by any national program anywhere in the world. Think about the weight of that moment, in that America, in that year. A barrier that had never been crossed at last. He never got the chance to make history in orbit. On December 8, 1967, just months after his selection, Robert Lawrence died in the crash of an F-104 at Edwards Air Force Base. He was gone before the manned orbiting laboratory was even canceled. The first African-American astronaut died on the ground, before his program died, before any of them ever flew. He was not the only one lost. Michael J. Adams, from that very first MOL group, left the program and went on to fly the X-15 rocket plane. On November 15, 1967, he died in an X-15 crash. Two men from a single program dead within a month of each other in 1967, and their program itself only had 2 more years to live before it, too, was canceled. Count the ones who never reached space from the MOL ranks. Adams, Cruz, Finley, Lawyer, McLeay, Neubeck, Taylor, Harries, Lawrence, Abrahamson. 10 men. 10 trained pilots who were promised the sky and never touched it. But if you think that's the whole story of waiting, it isn't. Because at almost the exact same moment, NASA was assembling a group of its own, and their story is arguably even more bitter. In August of 1967, the same summer Robert Lawrence was selected, NASA chose 11 brilliant scientist astronauts. Not test pilots, but researchers, physicists, physicians, an astronomer, an electrical engineer. Men with doctorates, chosen to bring science to spaceflight. Joseph P. Allen, Philip K. Chapman, Anthony W. England, Carl G. Hennies, Donald L. Holmquist, William B. Lenoir, J. Anthony Llewellyn, F. Story Musgrave, Brian T. O'Leary, Robert A. R. Parker, William E. Thornton. They arrived at NASA full of ambition and walked straight into a wall. The Apollo program's funding was already collapsing. The great expansion of the 1960s was ending. There were more astronauts than there were seats, and no science missions waiting for them. According to the accounts, the chief of the astronaut office, Deke Slayton, told these 11 newcomers something devastatingly blunt. "We don't need you around here." So they gave themselves a name. A dark, self-aware joke about exactly what they'd been told. They called themselves the XS-11, the XS-11, the surplus. The men NASA admitted on their first day it didn't need. And the waiting began. A waiting so long that 4 of them broke under it and walked away without ever leaving the Earth. Brian O'Leary resigned first in April 1968, objecting to the hazards of flight training. J. Anthony Llewellyn left in August 1968. He simply could not qualify as a jet pilot. Philip Chapman held on for years before quitting in July 1972, citing the lack of any real chance to fly. And Donald Holmquist gave up in September 1973 for the same crushing reason. The prospects were just too limited. 4 scientists, selected for the honor of a lifetime, who resigned having never once flown in space. But the 7 who stayed, they held on through something almost superhuman. They waited out the end of Apollo. They waited through the years when NASA had no new spacecraft flying humans at all. And they waited for one specific thing, a role that didn't even exist when they were hired. It was called the Mission Specialist, a job created in 1978 specifically for the space shuttle that finally allowed scientists to fly without being test pilots. 11 years after these men were selected, the very reason they'd been chosen finally had a place to go. Joseph Allen and William Lenoir first flew in 1982. Do the math on that patience. Selected in 1967, in orbit in 1982. An average wait across these survivors of roughly 16 years from the day they were chosen to the day they finally flew. 16 years. A person can be born and nearly grow up in the time these men spent waiting for a seat. And one of them turned that patience into a legend. Story Musgrave, selected in that XS-11 in 1967, went on to fly not once, not twice, but 6 times aboard the space shuttle, across a career that ran from 1983 all the way to 1996. The man from the group NASA said it didn't need became one of the most flown astronauts in its history. So here is the pattern, laid bare. 2 groups of men, 17 military pilots whose program was canceled without a single crewed flight. 11 scientists told on arrival that they were surplus. Between them, a dozen who never reached space at all. Some who resigned, some who died on the ground. And the survivors of both groups, forced to wait 12, 15, 16 years for a machine, the space shuttle, that hadn't even been built when they signed up. They didn't fail the test. The programs failed them. The budgets failed them. The timing failed them, which leaves one question worth sitting with. We remember the ones who flew, Crippen, Truly, Musgrave. But how many people in a hallway or an airfield somewhere right now are being told the same 3 words the XS-11 were told? We don't need you. Moments before the very thing they were built for finally arrives.